Okay, I'm going to share my screen. All right, Gabe. So I know the title of this little presentation here, which I will post in Canvas, says Principles of Trauma-Informed Teaching. The reason why I'm doing this first part of this presentation is when we're dealing with individuals of trauma, again, I'm going to bring back this example. We start usually with a psychoeducational approach, and then we lead into a therapeutic approach if it's necessary. So this is a reason I'm using this term. So when you're thinking about doing groups with people of trauma, what you're trying to do is foster a safe and supportive environment. And the methods considered to impact on trauma on students' learning or your clients' learning and well-being. So this is a difficult part about psychoeducational groups. And I will bring this up in what I usually have to do with an introduction to psychology class. I always have to give a trigger warning that when I'm talking about this last part about abnormal mental illness, if something triggers you and makes it so you don't want to come back to the class, step away, get a hold of me, let's talk about it. And this is the hard part about psychoeducational groups, is because it is an educational period, which you may trigger a trauma response that may make it so they don't want to come back. But there are some core principles that we can use in the group setting that we've talked about throughout this semester. Is one, we can foster safety by empowering our clients, by giving them a choice where they sit, giving them the ability to empower themselves, all of those things that we've been talking about throughout the semester. Trustworthiness, knowing that they're going to come here and they're going to listen to information that they can actually trust. And in the group system, the peer support, empowerment. And I love this new word. It's not a new word, but it was coined in 2014 called cultural humiliation, humility. All right. A lot of times when we do a lot of trainings in mental health, social work, we always talk about cultural diversity. And it's about accepting the diversity of a community. I really like this different term of cultural humility, about saying, it's not about me accepting your culture. It's about me having the humility that that's your experience and that's where you come from. And that's where you have your lived reality. And that's an important part about this group development experience. So I encourage you to start using this term cultural humility instead of cultural diversity. Because one says, I accept it, the other one says, I want to understand it. And those are very different terms and very different outcomes when we look at it. Okay. Understanding trauma and its impact. We need to talk about trauma at different levels. And the first very level is trauma results from what? If you've taken social work 171, 291, if you've taken the addiction classes, if you've taken the Psych 101 classes, if you haven't heard this term from those classes, let me know. You've probably heard this term adverse childhood experiences. Okay, what is an adverse childhood experience? It is an accumulation of trauma due to emotional neglect, psychological neglect, physical neglect, biological neglect, and social neglect. And the combination of those experiences we have had found without the right resiliency factors has a huge impact on an adult's ability to adapt. Okay, so we didn't talk a lot about it in this group. I hope that all of you will make sure you take a human development class, child development class. Please go learn about this, especially if you're going to work with especially addiction and co-occurring disorders. And then, of course, abuse, neglect, and chronic stress all develop into what we call trauma. The other aspect that we need to talk about is the impact brain development, emotional regulation, and cognitive development. Is trauma has the ability to influence all of these factors. And I always bring this up in when we're dealing with especially foster children who enter into this system because of some severe trauma that then was recognized. What we tend to find is that if a child was traumatized at the age of, let's say, 10, she is stuck, she or he or they tend to be stuck in that developmental stage for up to 10, 15, 20 years later. So you can have someone coming to your group who has the chronological age of a 30 to 40-year-old, but the emotional cognitive development of a 12 to 20-year-old. And so we have to resist the urge to say that group member is just immature, that it's because of them, they just didn't grow up and become adults like we commonly think in our normal day-to-day thinking, okay? So that's one other level. Trauma-informed teaching recognizes the effects and adapts strategies to meet, again, our group members' needs, okay? All right, but let's talk about what are called post-traumatic response symptoms, all right? And this is where we need to talk about the difference between symptoms and a disorder. Most people, when they go through a trauma, will have symptoms of that trauma. Recognition and experience of witnessing a traumatic event. These symptoms can affect us emotionally, psychologically, and functionally. Okay, now I want to bring this up. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, it was recognized in the Civil War. In World War I, it became shell shock, and then it became a full-blown disorder in World War II and Vietnam, was this long-term effect of this trauma, that no matter what area of the person's functioning, these symptoms would arise. Now, this is an important distinction, okay? In certain situations, a person can have symptoms. And in that situations, they need corrected, because if not, they will go, again, if we go down the co-occurring disease line, they will start to use drugs, alcohol to alleviate that symptom. They won't be able to manage that. So they might not be able to function in their work or their life or other life areas, but they may still be able to function in other areas of their life, okay, such as being a mother or father or grandparent or whatnot. When it's a disorder, and this is an important distinction in understanding the difference between symptoms and the disorders, is when it's a disorder, it impacts every part of the person's functional life. So when it's a full post-traumatic stress disorder, the person isn't able to function well in their work life, their wake-sleep life, their social life, and any of those areas of life that are important. But, and this is an important thing, is that whether they're experiencing symptoms or the full PTSD, it's leading them to where they are now, right? So the causes are triggers to an event such as an accident, natural disaster, abuse, or combat. And so this is where we need to note the difference between acute versus chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is, when we think about children who were raised in abusive homes, and then they're into their adult life, trying to manage those symptoms. We can think of individuals who are in combat constantly, and they come back with that trauma. When we look at acute, we can see a single incident that created these triggering events. Okay. And so probably one of my best examples of acute versus chronic is an acute event is I worked at a college. It was actually here in Arizona Western College, where I did their behavioral health center, where we had a student who, for some reason, according to her friends, could not drive anymore. She would panic when she went near a car, especially steering wheels. And she couldn't do anything with it. She kept it inside. No, I'll walk. She walked 3 miles a day to get to school, and this wasn't functional. Okay. So they referred her. She came in and she agreed. But what had happened in the situation is that one day she was at a four-way stop. And she came to a legal stop, apparently, from what I understand, and so was everyone else. But another vehicle who had the right of way went through, and another vehicle who thought they did sped right through the four-way as if there was no stop sign. And so a lot of us we've all seen accidents. We've all seen that. But let me explain the situation. At that moment, that student was holding their steering wheel very tight. And they see this horrific accident. In that horrific accident, even though they weren't involved with it, they see a decapitated head bounce across the street right in front of their vehicle. Okay? This is an example of acute trauma. That it doesn't take long-term abuse for someone to become completely debilitated because of trauma, right? And I will tell you, in the end, I'll give this up. We worked with that student for like 6 months. It was and if we were in a treatment class, I'd go over the treatment modality. But yes, she did eventually be able to go into the car, drive her vehicle, and come back and forth from school. But it took intense, 1, education, 2, analysis, and then 3, the treatment. And this is why I leave trauma for the end of this class, is with trauma, 1, it starts with education for most people going through trauma. Then it goes through understanding about the individual's experience in individual counseling. And then 3, coming to groups who understand your trauma and what you're going through so that you can process it with people who have gone through a similar event that you have gone through. Okay. Now, chronic trauma has a different kind of taste to it. And I want to bring this up because there are individuals who have gone through chronic trauma who won't display any trauma symptoms whatsoever. Because what did they do? They adapted to those symptoms, but are they functional for the individual? No. And then there's individuals who have gone through chronic trauma, who everything in their life becomes a trauma symptom. Okay. So with chronic trauma, what we have to work with is this history of trauma and either why it's being denied, going back to those defense mechanisms that we talked about in the beginning of the semester, or why they're applying those traumas to every relationship in their life. Okay. And so duration of trauma symptoms can last for weeks, months, and years. If it goes untreated, sometimes lifetimes. The person that I worked with trauma outside of the prison setting because they were confined there. The last trauma victim that I worked with domestic violence was 69 years old, I believe. It was either 69 or 76. I can't remember right at the top. That was a long time ago. But anyways, this is how long these symptoms can do and cause dysfunction continually through an individual's life. So, what are the common symptoms of post-traumatic response? And we can divide these into three categories: emotional symptoms, psychological symptoms, and behavioral symptoms. Emotional symptoms should not be surprising. Anxiety, that it's going to occur again. Depression, that I don't feel worthy because I was that person who went through that trauma. Fear and helplessness, guilt and shame. Now, I want to just kind of pause here for a moment on these two. Fear and helplessness and guilt and shame. And we need to go to do two different categories of traumatic response. So I'm going to talk about combat trauma when it comes to fear, helplessness, guilt, and shame, and victimized trauma. When we deal with people who are dealing with combat trauma, they often feel survivor guilt. They often go, why am I spared? Why did the people I'm there in that trench going through that, why am I the one that is alive? Okay. And then on the chronic trauma emotional response is that often with people who go through chronic trauma, they have experienced years and years, sometimes decades and decades of something we call victim blaming. Victim blaming is when I see someone who has went through a trauma and I think I could not go through that because I'm different than them. So I don't blame it on the offender, I blame it on the victim. And I say, well, I'm a man, she's a woman. According to the record, she was dressed scantily because she was a high, wondrous person. That's why she ended up being that, doing that. With young boys, it's not the priest, it's the boys. Because they wanted so much for that priest to just appreciate them. It was because of their own self-worth. That's the reasons they have fear and helplessness and guilt or shame. Okay, now let's talk about the psychological symptoms. I have already expressed this in this class before: intrusive thoughts or flashbacks and nightmares. I've told you that when I used to work with individuals who had an acute violent sexual assault, I would usually set on my calendar to get a hold of them about 9 months later, because that's when they have some distance and that's when the brain is saying, hey, here you go, here's your memories, enjoy them. And I also explained earlier in the semester, this is why some individuals don't experience intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, and nightmares until they leave the home that they were being abused in. And they have these symptoms. But it's the brain saying, and this is the thing that is the psychoeducational part, is the brain's not saying you are crazy, there's something wrong with you. We want you to remember this so you don't go back to that. Okay. Two other issues that we also need to make sure we talk about is hypervigilance and difficulty concentrating. Hypervigilance is that anything, especially a trauma victim has gone through, they're going to analyze at a very hyper vigilant level. And this is the art about giving trauma-informed classes and everything, is you need to be very careful about the words you use. Because the words you use will either be used against you, oh, you're that kind of person, or they'll be used for you saying, okay, you understand me. But they're at such a hypervigilance level, they break down every sentence you make, every comment you make. They are breaking down and they're putting it in their understanding of trauma. Okay. And then, of course, difficulty in concentrating. This is one of the hardest part about giving trauma groups, is that you see a lot of fidgeting. They don't want to be there. They don't want to understand it. And there's just such difficulty focusing, because what they're focusing on that moment is survival. They're focusing on making sure tomorrow isn't going to be the same day it was yesterday. And so those are the psychological symptoms. On the behavioral symptoms, we see avoidance, of course. We see irritability and aggression. We see substance abuse to mask all of the psychological and emotional symptoms that we see. And we also see a lot of social withdrawal. And this is the part of the group process that all of us could make better for a person who has gone through trauma. This is why a lot of trauma groups are not individually based, like trauma treatment. It's usually not individually based. Yes, there's a few first sessions with an individual provider, but what they want you to go into is a group where you will feel and be understood by people that have experienced the same thing that you have experienced, or the victim or the client has experienced. Okay. All right. Now I do want to pause and take a moment and talk about an important trauma consideration when we're working with Native American students or clients. This term that has been thrown around a lot, you probably have heard it in social work classes and in addiction classes and whatnot, or just in general conversation about this idea of historical trauma. All right. And so I'm just going to give a definition of this, and I'm going to read it verbatim on the slide. Historical trauma refers to the cumulative emotional, psychological wounds across generations caused by traumatic events experienced by a group. Specifically for Native Americans, this includes colonization, forced removal, cultural suppression, systematic discrimination. And I think the other thing that I keep forgetting to add to this slide is the physical violence that occurred. It was almost a complete genocide of most Native, if not all, a lot of Native American communities. Okay, so as a professor, I know you all see me on the camera. I'm a white dude. And I get that. And so a lot of these talks I give in front of white people, or people who don't understand why are Native Americans claiming historical trauma, blah, blah, blah. We all have historical trauma, no matter where we come from. If we're a white European, there's centuries, if not millennia, of trauma. If we're African, okay, any of these groups, they can claim that they have this historical trauma. And so I want to explain the difference between historical trauma that happens with people and this historical trauma that occurs with people like Native Americans, okay, is when you look at historical trauma for most societies, it occurs over thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It occurs almost 10,000 years of recorded history for African Americans, European Americans, Middle Eastern Americans, Asian Americans, that trauma and the overcoming of that trauma has happened over millennia. All right. For Native Americans, however, that trauma was condensed. If we look at the continent of America, we're talking 14 something. Columbus came here in 1496, I think, somewhere around there. So we're talking, what, 1492. So let's raise it up to 1500. We're up to 2022, 700 years. We look at Native American here in the United States trauma, and don't get me wrong, the Mexican government, the South American governments did just horrific things against Native Americans there. But if we look at United States, we're now talking 1765, then they won the revolution, 1795. So let's round it up to 1800, 1900, we're talking 3,400 years of trauma that has occurred here just in the United States. And it's that concentrated trauma that we are now seeing with modern science being laid down on genetic codes. Where again, I've expressed this in this class before, I'm waiting for replication on these studies, but there's a growing evidence when you have this concentrated amount of trauma on an individual group, it actually starts to change the genetic code of the individual. All right. And so when we look at groups like Native Americans, we can talk about enslaved African Americans that were brought here. We can kind of see that same trend happening with them. There's similar trends that are occurring with post-Holocaust survivors of the Jewish religion. We're seeing these same type of things growing with those individuals because of that concentrated trauma. That's what makes historical trauma an important topic for us to talk about when it comes to different groups, okay? Especially Native Americans, because the impact is it's a mental health challenge. And I highlighted this, there's a loss of cultural identity, which I hope that I showed through this course over and over and over. When there's a loss of identity, there's a loss of self, which leads then to things like substance abuse, mental health issues, all of those things. And we also see social economic struggles, disruption in family and community structures. So when we think about the Native American experience, and between Native American groups, there can be a difference in the severity of these issues. Is when we talk about trauma severity, we're going to use this term. This F is a function of, and everything in these parentheses is the function of trauma severity. So historical trauma plus lived trauma, the trauma you experience being here, whether you were abused as a child, abused as an adult, you have high ACEs scores because of emotional, psychological neglect. And then we're going to put this minus resiliency factors. Do you have those structures in place, both within yourself and within your community and your family, that allows you to manage this historical trauma and these lived trauma experiences? And as you would probably guess, is that maybe some of you, maybe a lot of you, have this historical trauma and you had this lived trauma and you went through some hard times and you built these resiliencies. And that's what makes it to where you're the successful human you are today. Is you built those ideas that I'm more than my trauma, I'm more than what I have experienced. And I am proud, and I'm going to bring this back up here. I'm proud of where I come from, and I won't deny it for anyone. Those are our resiliency factors. And in a lot of our communities, what is missing in all of these? One, I'm going to get on a soapbox here. One, a lot of our youth are losing their cultural identity. This was brought up in a presentation I did recently when they asked about language. I said, once language dies, culture dies. And in a lot of our Native American communities, language is becoming non-existent. So now you have a group of people who don't understand where they came from. And then you add the social economics because of the forced placements, all of those other things. The resiliency is hard to overcome. So in a lot of our social educational groups, this is what we would present. And we'd say, this is where we're at. Where do we need to go from here? And I think there was someone in the class, and I hope you raise your hand and say, hey, that was me, who mentioned that in a group that they do, they have them go back and write letters and whatnot to their grandparents and stuff like that, and really deal with both the positive and negative trauma experiences they have gone through. And I appreciate that person for bringing that example up. But that's kind of the equation we're using to really understand how much historical trauma affects the individual. Because despite all the trauma we have had, if we have this, if we have resiliency and those in place, we'll be okay. So some important considerations when we're working, again, in the psychoeducational setting, and you guys all know this. I don't think this needs to be something that I need to bring up, because I know you're all working with your communities, but I do think it's because it's part of the curriculum, we should bring these up. One, cultural responsive education. This means incorporation of Native American history, culture, and perspectives into curriculum in your psychoeducational groups. And bring an awareness about cultural pride and awareness. That we shouldn't be ashamed of our past. That we should embrace it because we survived in this land, in this area of longer than or as long as those who came and repressed our culture, and take that power back. Trauma-informed practices, informing and respond to the effects of historical trauma by creating supportive, understanding, and safe learning environments. And it goes back to all of these things that we've talked about through this semester, about making sure that your environment responds to your clients, that they create it, not us. That as I had mentioned, usually when I set up a group room, there was no tables, there were no chairs. I would come in as a group facilitator and I would say, hey guys, we should do a circle so that we can face each other. You guys do it. You choose the seating arrangement. Okay. Community engagement, and this is the other aspect, collaborating with Native communities to integrate traditional knowledge, language, practice into education. I'll bring this up on a Town-Otham Community College level. I can't just create a curriculum for you guys without going through a committee that is called the HIMDOG Committee. This HIMDOG community represents the Town-Otham community. And as extension, because we've expanded since then, Native American communities. And nothing I do curriculum-wise will get approved unless it integrates things like traditional knowledge, language, practices into our educational practices. And the last thing is promote resilience, focus on strengths, foster positive identity, develop and empower students. And so I'm going to bring this to my level. Oftentimes, as an instructor, when I go into meetings and stuff, and I hear about students who are not performing as good, often the instructor is tempted to say, it's not because of me, it's because of the student. And so they'll say, because high school didn't prepare them, because they don't have transportation, because they don't have the resources, they don't have this, they don't have that, they can't. Okay. Now, and I want you to resist, if you're going to go to trauma treatment, especially, resist that attempt to say that the victim is the victim because they did something. Don't do the victim blaming, but instead focus on their strengths, foster their identity, empower them. So instead of saying this is what's wrong with you, promote what's right with you. Promote what are your strengths, what are your abilities, what can you do today to make your life better? And when the excuses start to happen, that's when you as a group facilitator have to stop back and go, we're not going to make excuse. We're not going to make victim blaming part of this group. Let's identify what we can do. Let's build our resiliency. Okay. All right. So I think this is the last part of this presentation because we've already gone over most of this. So at this point, I just wanted to give you a flavor of trauma-informed treatment, of trauma-informed ideas. And then what we'll go into next Wednesday is the different strategies from the psychoeducational group to the informed group. What is that called? Sorry, I'm having your instructors even have these. We have brain farts. Where it's a group supportive group, kind of like Al-Anon or one of those, to a treatment group. Okay, I'll explain those better on Wednesday once I get my language back in my head. But I am going to